And today we're going to talk about, I think, a similar situation which has not been getting enough attention. That's the benzodiazepines. They were made available, became available in the 1960s, and have been very powerful in their effectiveness, but they've also brought certain problems with them. And I think that particularly with all the attention to the opioids, the benzos have not been getting all the attention they deserve. To some extent, we've been hearing about some of them because of combining with opioids, but I think they really deserve attention in their own right, and that's where we come back to Dr. DuPont, who has had a very broad range of interest himself, both in the drug addiction field, but also in the world of anxiety disorders. So he's got unique dual expertise and can speak to us about benzodiazepines, both the therapeutic benefit and the problems. I won't go through all of his achievements, but I'll just hit a couple highlights. That he was the first head of National Institute of Drug Abuse. He was the second, which is now called the drug czar. He has continued to both have an active private practice and be involved with all kinds of studies, including really the gold standard study on impaired physicians and a 5-year follow-up from that. So there are many different things he could talk about. He's written extensively about addictions, has published books on everything from AA to marijuana to with his title is The Selfish Brain. So he can cover the whole world of biopsychosocial issues around addictions, and I'm really pleased that he's agreed to come here. He and I have been friends for quite a few years, and we agree on many things and we disagree on things, and whenever we disagree, I learn a lot from disagreeing with Bob. So thank you very much for being willing to do this, and I will turn you over to the audience, and I'm sure they will.
Thank you very much, Dr. Kolodner. Well, I appreciate that introduction. I'm overwhelmed emotionally by the memories George has brought up about those years long ago. And I'm going to say a few words about those, but before I do, I want to say a word about this lecture and how it's honoring the original Dr. Kolodner. We have in the front row here two of his sons. And I think that George said we've been friends. He said we disagree about things. I can't think what that is, but I'm sure there's something that's there that he's thinking about. I can't think what it is. But George is really a hero in the community, in the field. He started the Kolodner Clinic, which is an unbelievably excellent outpatient program. And he's been a leader at ASAM. And so I'm here to honor all three of the Dr. Kolodners, but extra special George Kolodner, who is somebody I have known for 40 years and just admire tremendously. Now, George talked about the early years and how I got here in 1971. And let me say a few words about that. I finished my training in 1968. I was at Emory College and then Harvard Medical School, did my residency at Harvard, and I came down to NIH, which during the Vietnam War was a lot harder to get into than Harvard Medical School. But when I finished, I had 32, I went to get my first job. First time I actually had a career kind of job was after I finished my residency. And what was I going to do? And I had worked one day a week in a prison in Massachusetts called the Norfolk Prison. And I really was fascinated by the people who were in prison. Their stories, who they were, what was going on in society about that. And so, as I like to say, I had a choice to make, I chose prison. So I went to work for the District of Columbia Department of Corrections on a full-time basis. I had no other activities, no other interests. I was in corrections up to my eyebrows. And in that context, that was in July 1st of 1968 that I did that. At the time, Washington was in the midst of a crime epidemic. in that presidential election, that was a presidential election year, and Richard Nixon, who was running for office, called Washington the crime capital of the nation. Lyndon Johnson, who was then the president, had appointed the crime commission for D.C. And when I was at the corrections, the question came up of why do we have a crime epidemic? What is happening? And so what I did was take some urine bottles to D.C. jail and collect urine on everybody coming into D.C. jail for the month of August in 1969. And what we found was that 44% of them, even losing thin layer chromatography, which we had then, were positive for heroin. And when you mapped out the year they first started heroin and saw this rise from the early 60s to the 1969, in terms of the incidence of that, it mapped perfectly with what went with the crime problem. And that was published in the New England Journal of Medicine. And that established the connection and gave an answer to something, part of what was going on. And then my job was to figure out what to do about it. And that's how I got to Vincent Dole and Marie Neiswanger and Jerry Jaffe and all kinds of other people in 1969. But the first methadone in the city of Washington was on September 1st, 1969. And I needed to have somebody to help me do that. I didn't know how to do that. I needed help. And where did I think I would? Man alive. And I hired a guy who was working for Man Alive, who was a recovering heroin addict, who was taking methadone himself. His name was Bob Holden. And I brought him down to Washington to start methadone in Washington, which had nobody. Baltimore was way ahead of us in that regard. And when my colleague, our fellow psychiatrist and physician, Howard Hoffman, I recruited him to start a private program in Washington because when I was the governor, we needed a private program. And so Howard said, who can I get to start my program, which is called PIDAR? Bob Holden from Man Alive started all that. So that's a Baltimore connection, a Man Alive connection. Okay. And I still am very actively involved with the criminal justice system, and we may want to talk about that. We'll have some questions, but it's very, very important, that connection to all of these things. Okay, George said I've had an experience with benzodiazepines, and that is for sure in all parts of my career. So I'm going to take a little a trip with you about the benzodiazepines and some carefully chosen slides here. But I want to invite you, as George did, to talk about anything you might want to talk about, including benzodiazepines, but not limited to that. Okay, what are we going to do? What are we going to accomplish here? First of all, when I started medical school, everybody thought what the addict's problem was withdrawal. That's why they use drugs. They get sick when they don't use drugs. And so that was the definition of addiction at that point in time. And I want to separate those two phenomena, physiologic dependence and addiction. I want to help you think about the typical patterns of benzodiazepine use of anxious patients who are addicts and anxious people who are not addicts. And what can you observe about their use of the benzodiazepine? And I want to relate the benzodiazepine use to addiction treatment and identify some practical strategies for dealing with benzodiazepine discontinuation, which is a challenging clinical problem that you see faced. Now, George was talking about what's happening now. Benzodiazepines are in the news again. And they're in the news because of the connection with opiates. And we're going to talk some about that. But here you see some good examples from the CDC. Their deaths, about a third of the opioid-related deaths have benzodiazepines. Actually, the CDC's numbers on deaths are a little suspect because the medical examiners don't always report all the drugs they're using. But the reports is a third of them are in there. And you see the hospital emergency room visits are very large for benzodiazepines also. Now this is, I think, kind of interesting to look at a trend over time from emergency room dawn data. And the top line you'll see is the benzodiazepines alone, and you see the rising rate that goes right along with the opiate dependence problem. The second line is the benzodiazepines and opiates, and the green line is benzodiazepine alcohol, and then the bottom one is with both alcohol and the opiates. But they are certainly very often combined with other drugs, and we're going to talk about that. But that shows a very dramatic increase of what's going on. But look at this. This is the data, now not from an emergency room, as the previous slide was. This is the slide about from the household survey, as it's called, persons 12 and older, and that's a pretty flat line through all those years. You'll notice that there, in that study, the benzodiazepines are listed as tranquilizers, and obviously the opiates are the prescription pain relievers. This is even more striking over roughly those years. This is the high school seniors, and their likelihood of using tranquilizers is the category that Lloyd Johnson uses, and you see that steady decline. It's going on over that period of time. This is some data from Quest Diagnostics about their results of physician-ordered laboratory tests. 54% showed drug misuse, 45% had one or more drugs in addition to what was prescribed, and that was up from the previous year at 35%. And that gives you an example of how much there is of physicians don't know about what they're don't know about this. This is quite striking. This is the TEDS data, and you'll notice the downturn in the benzodiazepine treatment there. But look at the underline there. This is the figure I want you to really notice. Only 0.9% of treatment admissions are for benzodiazepines. We're going to talk about why that is in a little bit, even though they're sexually dominant drugs in so many ways. But this shows an entirely different trajectory than the emergency room data. Okay, how do we get here? Well, in terms of the things that we're talking about, particularly anxiety-related problems, for alcohol, there's a long history of use of that. And for a long time, what doctors had to treat anything with was alcohol and opium. But then came the dramatic breakthrough in 1903 with the barbiturates. And those of you who are a little younger than George and Rob and me don't realize that the barbiturates were a major part of medicine in the earlier years between 1903 and 1970s, and were a leading cause of suicide death. And lots and lots of people died from suicide and accidental overdoses of barbiturates. And so when the benzodiazepines came, which we have ample reason to be ambivalent about, they were miraculous because they didn't kill people, and that made a huge difference. And it was a euphoria because it's connected to the barbiturates. Once you take the barbiturates away, it doesn't look quite so terrific. How did this happen? Hoffman LaRoche developed these products. Librium was the first in '55, marketed in 1960. And the observation they made, which they were looking for drugs to do what the barbiturates did. And the wonder that they found when they got Librium was that it calmed the animal. They called it taming. So the animals became tame when they were previously aggressive. And they didn't stagger the way they did with barbiturates. They didn't show the impairment in their motor behavior that you saw with the barbiturates. And that combination was a bingo experience for them. And Valium came in 1963, and let's just say the world changed. I had to put in there my personal experience. That's the year I graduated in medical school, so I have a particular feeling about Valium. Okay, what did they do? They reduced anxiety and fear, and that was the issue with those animals. Insomnia, muscle spasm, seizures are good epilepsy drugs. And it's very interesting to me what the three benzodiazepines that Hoffman LaRoche introduced were Valium, Valium, and Klonopin. And they knew that physicians had limited capacity to sort through how to use medicine, so they said, okay, even though they all have basically the same kind of effects, we're going to market them in entirely different markets for the three drugs. So Valium was for anxiety, Galmain was for sleep and Klonopin was for seizures. That's what happened. That's how they got that way. That's how they got into medicine like that, because we couldn't figure out if any of them would work in any of those reasons at the time. But it was I think, very interesting to think about that. They were all long half-life drugs. And so all the things that came after were trying to reduce that, to make it short half-life. And how ironic that when Xanax came in, and we'll talk about that in a little bit, that was the short half-life, and people became worried about half-life, and then they wanted long half-lives. And that's how we got Kolodner as a drug that we like better than Xanax so much. Well, this miracle had a downside, and the most obvious was a phrase that became commonplace: benzodiazepines are booze in a pill. And if you have that idea in your mind, you're going to have some idea of how this works in terms of drug abuse problems, and also the long-term effects. This is a different aspect of concerns about the benzodiazepines: automobile accidents, cognitive impairment, falls in the elderly, for example. But the one that's really got us now is the overdose deaths. And here's this class of drugs that don't produce overdose deaths. You can hardly die of a benzodiazepine. Take a ton of it, and you won't die. But take it with alcohol, take it with opiates, boom, lights are out. And that difference it explains a lot of what's going on with the overdose problems. Now, George was talking about my personal practice for life in medicine. I started, as you heard, an overly long view on college and high school about 1968, and what happened to me, and I got into this thing through the prison door, through the crime, through methadone, and then I became the head of NIDA. And George didn't mention it, I think I'm the only person in the world who has known all 16 White House drug czars personally. I've known all 10 heads of DEA, and of course the 5 heads of NIDA are all friends of mine over the course of this period of time. DEA started in 1973, the same year NIDA started, for example. But I was thrown out of the government in 1978. A fellow named Joe Califano came in, and he wanted to do head to all the institutes, and so I was history. First he fired the head of NIMH, then he fired the head of NAAA, and then it was my turn to walk the plank. Now, to say that at that point I had not planned to make that change in my career would be an understatement. And I became very anxious, let's say, about my future and what I was doing in the world, and figured that this drug thing was some accident in my life, and I needed to be able to do something other than drugs. I had a patient who was agoraphobic, who wasn't getting better with my psychotherapy. George said I've had a private practice all these years. And she came in one day and said, there's a new way to think about treating what my problem is. Well, I didn't even use the word agoraphobia at that time. She looked this up, and I said, well, tell me about that. And where did you read that? She said, I read it in Glamour magazine. I said, I don't learn from Glamour magazine. Come back again next week and we'll talk about this. Then she came in, and a couple of weeks later, and she said, look, I know this is hard for you, but I got the telephone number of the guy who's referred to here. Why didn't you give him a call? I thought, well, I could probably do that. So I called the guy up, and I was Manuel Zane from White Plains Phobia Clinic, and it changed my life. I was just incredibly fascinated, partly because I was so frustrated in dealing with the patient. And so she was finishing her school. She was a school teacher who couldn't drive, so her husband was a lawyer and had to drive her to work. That was a problem for them. So she had relatives in White Plains, and she said, I want to go up there and join the White Plains Phobia program this summer, and why don't you come too? And I did. And the visit changed my life more than it did hers. And I came back and became utterly fascinated with the anxiety disorders. And the rest of my life, as George said, I've written books about this. I was the founding president of the Anxiety Disorders Association of America, a leading group in the anxiety disorders. And I have deep roots. People I know in anxiety don't know anything about my life in addiction. People in addiction don't know anything about my life in anxiety disorders. So I've got the schizophrenic view. But what's the big issue in both of them? Benzodiazepines. So that brought me to you. Now, this is probably, I don't know, I think the most important thing clinically. Addicted patients, what do they do when the doctor prescribes benzodiazepines? So you're going to prescribe, let's say, Xanax. That's most common. We'll see about that. What do they want? They want the 2 milligram pill. And what happens when you prescribe this to them? They get a limited benefit, but they really like the medicine. And they also are using alcohol and other drugs. So the benzodiazepines boost the effects of the other drugs. And what happens to the non-addicted anxious patient? And this was my life in anxiety. I saw tons of patients like this. I didn't believe it because with my background in addiction, all I saw was problems. It was a poison in my world of addiction. But now I've got these anxious patients, and when I have an anxious patient come in and I think I'm going to prescribe a benzodiazepine, the first thing they say is they don't want any medicines. So I write a prescription for Xanax for 0.25. They come back the next time, did that help you? I didn't take it. Really? So, well, why did you cut it in half? So they'll cut it in half. And then once they start on it, what happens to them? They're stable at these low doses. 0.25 is the standard dose. Maybe a half milligram. That would be unusual to do that. And I don't have to try to keep them down to low levels. They have no interest in taking it. They're very afraid of addiction. So is this going to addict me? And what is that? They'll come in years later and tell me, oh, I'm addicted to the Valium, whatever it is. And I say, what do you mean you're addicted to this? They say, well, I keep taking it all the time. I think that we're going to get to another slide. I'm jumping ahead with this, but this relates to this. Addiction has 2 qualities. You'll never get this from anybody else. But it's so simple. You're welcome to use this if it helps you. One is continued use despite problems. So to be an addict, you've got to have problems and you've got to keep using. You stop, you're not an addict. Okay, the second one is dishonesty. Addicts are always liars. You can't be pharmacology, that's judgmental. Why do you say that? It's really simple. And that is the addicted person is doing things that the people around that person don't want him to do. The doctors, the spouse, the kids, whoever. The only way the person can keep the chemical lover in the relationships is to lie. This is not complicated. So when I say to my patients, they come to me and they say, I'm addicted to this, and I say, okay, so let's look at this. Do you have continued use of some problem? Well, no, I don't have any problem. You sure about that? Did your husband say you don't have any problem? Yes, he thinks that. He's so glad I take this. Or whatever. Like this. Okay. And then I said, okay, how about dishonesty? No, why would I be dishonest about it? Wouldn't occur to me. I said, what you got with Zen is like me with my glasses. If you take my glasses away, I will show glasses-seeking behavior. But do I have continued use despite problems and dishonesty? No. Well, I'm not addicted to my glasses, and you're not addicted to the Xanax. Again, I think it's clear what it is once you have the concepts in mind, and it's really important to keep that clear. Okay, here's what I was just going through. And the difference between addiction and physical dependence, we really need to be clear about this. Because the patients can be physically dependent. That's true, and I explain that. That's different. So, you've heard what addiction is, but physical dependence is just tolerance to the drug effect. And when it's discontinued, with a drug discontinuation, you have a reversal of the effect. So what are the withdrawal effects? Insomnia, anxiety. Exactly what we're treating are what we call the withdrawal effects. And that's right. Now, how do you treat addiction? What is the treatment for addiction? Well, that's a big problem. We'll talk some more about that. You've got to go into a treatment program, you've got to work, you've got to go to AA and AA. It's a big deal to treat addiction. How about physical dependence? Nope. Gradual dose reduction. It really is that simple. You come down, we're going to talk some more about that a little bit later. But again, the concept is what's really important. Here we go again. Substance abuse treatment is long, recovery support, sobriety date. Addicts who are in recovery all have a sobriety. That's the last day they use alcohol or other drugs. They don't have a sobriety date, I don't think they're in recovery. I'm a little judgmental about that. Anyhow, it's hard. True physical dependence, just gradual dose reduction. This is another clinical point. It isn't just that there's anxious patients and addict patients. There are people who have addiction and anxiety. What about them? They are mostly like the addicts, not like the anxious patients. So put them in that category and treat them that way. And they will behave that way in terms of their doses. My experience is clear on that. This is another point that is really very, very important. The anxiety disorders are not benzodiazepine deficiency diseases. We do not need to put everybody who's anxious, or even anybody who's anxious, on a benzodiazepine. You can treat anxiety. All of the work I did in anxiety, I started in addiction with methadone. I started in anxiety with cognitive behavioral therapy. I only gradually got into using medications. And I really have a very strong belief in the importance of a non-pharmacologic treatment of anxiety. I'm going to talk some more about that. But it's a lot harder for the doctor to treat anxiety as a cognitive behavioral problem than it is to write a prescription. That's a problem for the doctor. Okay, now let's talk about anxiety treatment. The biggest problem with anxiety is to compare your, unless you have an anxiety disorder, to compare your anxiety to the patient's anxiety. You say, I can handle it, what's wrong with me? That's like saying an alcoholic, well, I can have a drink and walk away, but why can't you? Well, you don't get the disease. So when I say to people with anxiety disorders, I say, okay, this is a brain disease, it's biological, it's serious, but it doesn't kill you. It's not like cancer and heart disease. But what it does is in many ways worse. How can it be worse? It's worse because anxiety disorders rob you of the enjoyment of your life. They are really, really serious. Because they have a tremendously corrosive effect on the enjoyment of life. They limit people's activities. Really very important. It's also true that there's a character traits that go with anxiety. Not everybody, but a lot of them are very, people who are very conscientious to a fault. They have excessive empathy. They are people, you see somebody with anxiety, or you can be pretty sure that person did his or her homework all the way through school. That's not true for most substance abusers. They have a different character and structure. Most of them, not all of them, but a lot of them. So here is the summary of 30 years of treatment of anxiety disorder. In one word, acceptance. Experience the pain. It is real. It is serious. But the symptoms are distressing but not dangerous. And what makes those symptoms go on is your fearing them. It's called the second fear. It's the fear of the fear that causes the disorder. Now, it's not easy to convince somebody with an anxiety disorder that they can bear the pain and not run away from it. Get on the elevator when you're in elevator mode. Get on the airplane. Even, I know this sounds unbelievable, look forward to the pain. Welcome the pain by knowing it's not going to hurt you, other than be very uncomfortable. That's it. You're not going to pass out. You're not going to have a heart attack. You're not going to do something crazy. None of that stuff happens. But you're going to be miserable. That's right. And if you can accept that misery and go about your business, then, as I call it, the dragon has lost his control of their life. Hard sell. But when people can get that, it really makes a difference to them. Now, the common pattern of treatment for anxiety disorders is both in SSRIs and DZ. There's a lot of patients who have that situation. And you heard about him. I sort of made that case here. Now I'm going to talk about the benzodiazepines and the opiate epidemic. I mentioned that they don't cause respiratory depression on their own, but they do with other drugs, particularly alcohol and opiates and others. But it's also very interesting that we saw, it's really unusual to see somebody whose primary drug of use is a benzodiazepine. They are associate drugs. The drug users use the word boost. They are used along with the drugs of abuse, the primary drugs for the person. Usually, not always, but it's really unusual to see somebody who's got a drug abuse problem with benzodiazepines who doesn't use, and even use them with the other drugs. Now, I'm going to show some things in a second, but the FDA has gotten very, paid a lot of attention recently to this lethal lethality of the combination of, and I'm going to show some interesting data about that. But anyhow, the black box warnings are now on all the opioids and also other medicines as well, where the benzodiazepines are used, or in these things. Here's the use with other depressants, and look at the bottom there. What it says: limit the dose and duration to the minimum required. Follow patients for signs and symptoms of respiratory depression. I'm going to look at that with you in a minute, but that's what the black box says. Here's the same thing for cough products, and here's the one with opioids. Okay, here's a study from the VA. 27% of the veterans who received opioid anesthetics were also receiving benzodiazepines. A big percentage. About half of the deaths of these veterans from overdoses had benzodiazepines present. And the data show that the more they use benzodiazepines, and the higher the dose, the greater the risk of overdose death. I'm going to show you a study that was done of a methadone program, and we looked at the question. The study didn't start out to do this, but we went back to look at it. And that is, because there's a lot of drug testing, and we got records about what they're positive for. So the question was, well, what is the consequence in that program for somebody who has a positive test for benzodiazepine? That was the question we had in mind. What we found is those testing positive for a drug were 3 times more likely to leave treatment. Our endpoint was retention, program retention. So over the course of, I think it was 15 months, over the 15 months, the people who had positive drug tests were 3 times as likely. One drug positive with double the attrition, and multiple drugs quadruple the risk of not being retained. Okay, now this takes a minute to look at this. Then we looked at the question, okay, what's the difference between whether they had a prescription that was prescribed or not prescribed? I was surprised that so many patients in the methadone program had their own prescriptions from a doctor for a benzodiazepine. But a lot of them didn't. And so we looked at those 2. So the top one you got did not have a prescription. They were benzodiazepine, and dropping out in that 15-month period, 42%. Now the next one is 72%, 22 patients, twice as many did have a prescription. And look at their percent dropping out. It was indistinguishable from the people who had no positive test at all. That completely threw me. I had never thought about that before, but it's pretty striking. Methadone patients who had their own prescriptions did not drop out more than patients who did not use benzodiazepines, and then you see the ones who don't. And this group that did not have a prescription were younger and more male, which were also characteristics associated with lower retention. Okay, so why is it so common to have methadone in buprenorphine patients who take benzodiazepines with or without a prescription? And why do so few seem to die of overdoses? I doubt that, for example, in the Kolodner program, we've had many deaths from combination. Certainly in this methadone program, they didn't have any deaths from combination, even though it was quite a hard percentage that were using it. And the two things that I think are important are tolerance and dose. If the dose is lower, there's less likely to be a problem, and if they have tolerance. Once the person is tolerant on the opioids and tolerant to benzodiazepines, the likelihood of an overdose death is extremely low. When we had our methadone program, I was running the methadone program, if a patient had taken even 2 doses of methadone, we had nobody die from the overdose. The way they died from the overdoses when we gave them too much first, and then they died, they didn't have tolerance. So you had to keep that initial dose down. You didn't kill them with that, and they all died the same way when they did die. And then when they died in their sleep at night, they wouldn't die like a heroin addict, a needle addict. They would go to sleep and respiratory depression would kill them in that situation. So I think those are things, and what I'm talking about is many drug abusers use opioids and benzodiazepines in unstable patterns of dose and with tolerance. And I think that's what's killing them. And that's very different from the way things are looking at it. And here's this point again about the unstable doses and also very high doses. People who are using drugs non-medically use way higher doses than people who are using drugs medically. Okay, so a few things here, not quite the final thoughts. But after getting off the benzodiazepines, now I'm talking about patients who have been on benzodiazepines for a period of time, and it's notorious that that's a difficult thing to do. I was the principal investigator on the study called the cross-national study. It was that established Xanax for the treatment of panic disorder, and you might not know, it's very striking that Xanax was the first drug any time to have an indication of panic disorder. Never been done before, and that cross-national study was the seminal study that all of substance anxiety disorders used the model that we did in that study. So it's a very big deal, that study. I was one of 8 people from around the world who did that study, and we were the champs in one way. And that was, we were the only site that got everybody off of the Xanax. Everybody else couldn't do it. They had lots of people who were still on. And so the Upjohn company really liked us a lot. Because we showed it could be done. Why were we able to do it in the IMI? Because we were basically a program that dealt with panic without fear. So we were able to tell a person, do that, you can do that, be confident, keep going. And everybody else, they'd get weak in the knees, and the doctors would run for the cover in that situation. And that's always how I explained it. But what I say here is clinically difficult. It's not because it's pharmacologically difficult. It's pharmacologically very easy to reduce the dose. But it's hard for the patient, and the issue is how their motivation. When I say to the patient they want to come off, I say, well, how much do you want? And if you want to do it a lot, I'm your man. We can do that. But if you're just talking about it, I think you've probably got better things to do